Use that light. You just need to get it kind of like positioned so you can see it. I would just try.
I wonder if I could have it shine that way.
I would put it this way. The camera's off to this side.
I probably have to do something, huh? Before.
Well, normally what I would do is just start out almost like I'm doing a demo. You know, and
Talking?
Like, no, I'm doing this and this, like a normal demo. And then afterwards, questions start coming in, like whoever's asking will just interrupt me and be like, give me something else to talk about. Basically.
Okay. All right. So I guess we're live now. Can you hear me? Okay. So I am working on, I guess basically you could call it an illustration, but it's a painting. And this is a Santa scene. It is kind of small, so I probably approach painting smaller figures a little bit differently than painting larger figures. But I do try to have some continuity between the two. You know, one of the problems you might run into when you're painting really small heads or hands or whatever is a tendency to really go tight on everything. And I try to still retain some painterliness in working at a small scale. So the objective would be to make it feel like it's a larger image than it is. It's just you have to be a little bit more careful with what you're doing. I feel there's a little more freedom in a larger scale head, for instance, for small mistakes. Whereas when you're working on a tiny little head, even just the most minuscule mistake can add up to a really large flaw in the painting, especially if you were to enlarge it to full scale. So that's kind of something I think about is, would I let that slide on a large painting if I were to blow that up bigger? You know, sometimes you might have a tendency to just go, well, it's a cute, quirky little head, so I'll just go with it. But sometimes those things can look really funny later. So that's my tendency to be a little fearful of painting smaller scale images. So generally when I'm working in my studio, if I've done a really tedious little painting like this, then I'll switch over to doing a larger painting because it's just a little bit more of a relief. I mean, if you want to be able to paint multiple figures, you're going to have to scale things down. Unless you want to work gigantic. And my home is really small, so it's just not going to work. But in the beginning, I tried to work with a more graphic reed and lay in just some darks that will help kind of preserve the shape of things. But people often ask, how long does it take you to do one of those small heads? And sometimes they take longer than painting large heads, and that's not a joke. Sometimes I've spent 7 or 8 hours on a really, really small head. That's why it's important I have my drawing established. Because it has a tendency, things have a tendency to move on you when you're working tiny like this, and the next thing you know, nothing fits on there. You know, all of a sudden the child's foot is running off the end of the page. I try to kind of paint my light and dark pattern first, but then I also like to try to paint what's around the head, so that way I'm not having to go back in later and work those edges. So sometimes I'll block in a little bit and move to another area because it helps that set up a little bit, so that way when I come back in, working wet into wet, I can come back into that area and not have it fight me so much or lift up. So just around the perimeter, I'm actually going to be putting a Christmas tree in the backdrop. So I'm just going to block in some greens. And I'm using a pretty complementary palette. It's actually kind of limited, even though I have a lot of colors out. But it's basically a red and green theme, which I think works well for the subject. But without any blue, it is a little more difficult. You just kind of have to utilize cooler greens to represent those cools you need. Also, getting the background blocked in helps when I'm trying to mix colors for the skin tone, because those things affect the subject. And I keep it pretty thin. At home, though, I paint from my monitor for the most part. I prefer that now to printouts. Is that a sneeze, or are you getting sick behind me?
It's a cough.
Okay.
I got dust in the throat.
This is a pretty dusty place.
Meadow?
Yeah.
Since the tree in that reference picture seems like you just photo batch them together.
Yes.
How do you make it so that it doesn't, in the painting, it doesn't make it feel like it's cut out? Like if it's cut out, it feels like it belongs in the piece.
Correct. And that's something that I struggle with a lot in painting, because most of the times I'm combining at least probably 3 images together to make a scene. And a lot of times I'm having to combine different lighting situations or environments, like the colors and things. So one of the solutions that I've been kind of working on, especially this year, is I've been limiting my palette, so that way I create a more believable scene by harmonizing all the colors that are in that scene, so I'm not using everything on the color wheel. I found in the past that when I'm combining multiple pieces of reference, that I would have something with fall theme in one area and then a spring theme in another, and just trying to put everything in the painting, it would look out of place. So now by limiting my palette to a specific color gamut that's more scaled down, I can make a little bit more of a believable scene. The other thing I do is what I'm doing now, where I try to work the figure into the environment as I'm going so he doesn't get cut out. Whereas if I was to just work the positive space entirely and then later go back in and put in the negative space around it, it might have more of a tendency to be cut out because I have dry paint versus wet paint. So then I have to reactivate both sides to get those edges to blend. But B, I'm also not allowing that color to influence what I'm working on. So having this in the environment reminds me that it needs to be worked into him. Perhaps a little bit shows up and the beard is a little greener on one side than on the other because it's up against that scene. So you have to kind of imagine when somebody's in a scene and how the colors around them are affecting them in the different planes. And it's very difficult, but you don't get better at it without trying. And so that's something I've been really working on. Because believability in a scene with multiple pieces of reference is really key to the success of the painting. Because if something looks, like you say, photo bash, if it just looks like you just stuck a bunch of things in there, I feel that that's kind of not doing any justice to the subject. I mean, obviously my subject is the scene between them, but I also want that tree in there because it symbolizes the holiday. So I have, all those things in the images that kind of symbolize the time of the year. But yeah, that's a question that, I wish I knew all the answer, every part of the answer to, because I'm trying to figure it out myself. And I have to do a lot of painting or do a lot of reference gathering on location, and I don't always have the ideal conditions. So I might fly somewhere and do a photo shoot, and that day is overcast or raining or snowing. And then I want to combine that with something else that's on a sunny day. So it's just a real challenge. And I really like the challenge of it, but I wish there was an easier solution. I mean, obviously, if you can control your environment 100%, you'll have that as an asset. But I really don't have that. It's always what condition am I going to be up against when I go on location. And in the past, 5 or 6 years, I've had every different. I've literally been snowed out, rained out, been just overcast. I went to photograph the Teton Mountains in Wyoming, and it was snowing at the weirdest time of year, and I didn't even get to see the mountains one time because it was completely black and gray. And it was like the whole point, I went up there, the whole point to get this beautiful early fall reference with sun, and it was not happening. It's just, it kind of is what it is. I don't know how other artists do it. A lot of the more narrative painters that I enjoy looking at, I don't know if it's just that their skills are so immense that it doesn't really matter what reference they're painting from, or if they have ideal reference. I don't know.
Do you prefer painting from reference or in person?
That's a good question, if I prefer painting from reference or in person. And that answer would depend upon what I wanted from the painting. For instance, I prefer painting from life when I'm trying to get a really good color or edge sort of feel to something. But I really don't want to work from life for these longer, more intense paintings. I like to kind of sit and take my time on something. And when you're working from life, there is a different sort of sense of urgency about it that I feel it's kind of like, it's like a plein air gesture. You have that moment in time and you're just trying to capture it as quickly as possible. And so sometimes you let things slide when you're doing that. You might say, I'm not going to worry as much about drawing or my composition because I'm just quickly trying to capture this image. Whereas when I'm working from reference that I've very carefully put together and drawn in and everything, I like the luxury of time that it provides working that way. But I like working from life to help benefit my reference work. I think that they work together. And if you never get a chance to work from life, you miss out on certain important aspects of seeing. It's just not very practical to get to hire a model to sit for you. It's a real luxury if you were able to hire a model to sit for you. Also, it's like you can't paint anything that's dynamic if you're working from life because the model's not going to be able to stand on one foot or take a pose that's really critical. They're going to have to take a very careful pose, something they can hold for an extended period of time. So you're going to miss out on painting more interesting images in some ways because of the model's, inability to, and rightly so, the inability to, hold still for hours on end. Or like a kid, this is my nephew, and he was squirming and all over the place. So I just take a ton of pictures while he's moving around, and one of them, you end up getting 1 out of 100 that's really good. But there's no way you're going to have a kid sit for you. I mean, that would be kind of like, I don't know, child slave labor or something. So I wouldn't even I'd feel really bad if I had somebody sitting for me for that period of time. I understand in the past where you had the amount of money you made on a painting versus what you paid the model was at a ratio that would work for you to be able to work from life for the whole painting, but now that's not so much the case. You wouldn't be able to offset the cost of the model fee against the painting for most people, most working artists. They would have a really hard time paying the model.
Did you make the Santa costume?
No, so I did not make this Santa costume, but I did make a Victorian style Santa costume that he's wearing in some of the other pictures that I have of him. So I did a photo shoot with, a Santa model, and I knew he had his own costume, but I also wanted it to make a variety of costumes as part of the photo shoot. So I made a Victorian Santa costume as part of that photo shoot. But I do make a lot of my costumes. And I am planning on making more Santa stuff down the road. One of the things you run into when you're painting these Santa images is when you're painting the fur, the beard, and everything, you have a lot of these sort of white things that you're painting. So trying to figure out, how do I make one slightly different shade than the other so that way it's identifiable. I mean, generally the beard won't be quite as bright white as the fur trim. So that's one way to offset it. But I always start a lot darker than I end up because in order to make something look white, you kind of have to get a lot more darks into the scene. But even in the beard area, I might even throw some warmth into it just to convey the idea of skin underneath coming through in areas. I nearly always start darker than I end up with in the painting. You have to get enough contrast around him to make him important.
So Shade wants to know, since you do so much costume work, how do you like integrate that into the clothing design, into your compositions, like when you make choices for costume design?
My first priority when I am doing costuming is the texture of the material is a really big consideration, because if something is made, like I prefer natural fibers above all else, because of the way it'll take the folds is so much more pleasing to the eye than a synthetic fabric. So the first consideration I make is trying to find the optimal material, and I always like to have something that's as authentic as possible. And then my second choice would be color. I mean, because that's going to be a huge part of your painting, and so having a little bit of sort of like the thought of what's going to happen down the road in the painting. For instance, is it going to be set in an environment that's very muted and tonal? Maybe I want something a little bit more primary color, or is it going to be set outdoors, or I want something very spring colored? So the costume choices I make, they're usually planned around a photo shoot I have in the future. I might say, okay, I'm going to be working at this location, and so I'm going to need a costume that fits that. Typically, in the past, I would make at least 2 costume changes. Just like with Santa, he had his own costume, and then I brought a costume. That way I have a little bit more variety out of the reference. Now that I've been working primarily with more Native American themed paintings, those costumes are going to be much more dictated by the region of what I'm painting. But even that, I first consider how can I get the best quality buckskin to make this look and feel just like it would have back then. Because my first priority is to have a historical objective in the painting. So I want my material to be as close as possible to what they would have used during that time period. And when I worked in colonial era painting, I always got the best materials I could that were what they would have back then. either silks or linens or sometimes cottons, but never anything synthetic. Because synthetic, if you're trying to paint synthetic silk, it's just miserable to work with. It's hard to sew, and that's another thing. Those natural fiber costumes are much easier to work with. Although the Santa robe I made, I used an antique textile, and it had gotten so old that it was crumbling into pink and red dust all over the place. So my whole house was covered in this pink red silk dust. So that wasn't so great, but you know, it was a pretty decrepit fabric, and I made a new use for it. And you know, it held up for a photo shoot, but I don't think it's something I could use long term because it was already in pretty bad shape.
Teresa is interested to know what you have on the palette, what colors.
So I'm using, I mostly use Winsor Newtons for all my cadmiums. I like their quality and consistency. It's like my cad yellow and my cad red deep. Those are all Winsor Newton. This is a Winsor Newton permanent rose, and this is the Winsor Newton transparent maroon, which is probably my favorite color. And there's only a couple places that make that pigment. I have a Gamblin yellow ochre, I have a Winsor Newton cad yellow lemon. I have a couple Holbein colors. Holbein's a Japanese brand, and they make a really great range of colors. Like they make this ivory white, and they make this coral red, which is a really great color for mixing skin tones. I have a couple, I don't remember the names of these companies. They're like your basic flesh tones, but you can see they have different colors to them. This is I think it's a Williamsburg paint called Dianthus Pink. This is a Charvan paint, and it's called Compose Green. Let's see, I have another Holbein that's gray green, and I have a Da Vinci Viridian, Winsor Newton Ivory Black, a Holbein, it's like their monochrome gray, it's called, a Winsor Newton Olive Green. And then this is a Michael Harding. It's like called Brilliant Pink, I think. So I mainly use the Winsor Newtons for all the cadmiums, and then I have the Holbein and a couple other companies I use for all the weird colors. I also use some Gamblins for their Radiant line. And then this is a Terra Rosa, or not Terra Rosa, sorry, Transparent Red Oxide, and that is an M-gram color. But even though it looks like there's a lot of colors on here, and I picked them based on opacity versus transparency, but I've tried to consolidate them more into the red and green family for this particular painting. So even though I could make other colors, like I could make more oranges out of it if I wanted to, I'm trying to avoid that because that'll take it out of the gamut that I'm working in. And I find that gamuts are they're just a really good way to consolidate your thought process in painting. Makes it a lot easier.
Cindy wants to know what surface you're painting on?
This is the Centurion Deluxe Oil Prime Linen. You can buy it in pre-made panels. It's a pretty good value, and it's a really nice surface because it's really fine, which I really like for working on smaller paintings. But this, I bought a whole roll of it because I'm working on a weird size, a square.
So Turkey wants to know how long it usually takes you to complete a painting like this one.
So a painting like this, the completion time, if everything goes really smoothly, I would estimate, 40 to 50 hours, which sounds like a lot, but I spread that out. It'll probably take me a couple weeks to do it, so I'll work on it for 2 weeks at least. If it's not going well, it could take a lot longer because I might have to set it aside and then come back to it later because it's driving me crazy. But I've found that if I prepare ahead of time or do comps or do some sketches, it does help avoid complete disaster paintings. But you know, every so often that's going to happen. You're going to fumble through a painting. But I think the more prepared you are in the beginning of the painting, the more likely you will be able to complete the painting in a pretty timely fashion without too many obstacles. But you know, like an 8x10 like portrait, I can sometimes do those in a day. So you know, about 6 to 8 hours of painting if everything goes well. But because these are much smaller figures, like I spent, you know, like half a day just painting little baby feet. So it just depends on what you're painting.
Ted wants to know, when you mix your flesh tones using white, how do you avoid making it dull?
So one thing, I rarely use white in my flesh tones, but I do use colorful white. I guess colorful light value paints like this green or these pinks, or sometimes I have a purple or a blue on my palette, and they're like a higher key pastel color, and I use them in place of white. The reason I like to use a colorful white rather than just using the whites is because when I look at white, I look at it as almost being like a cool gray you're adding to all your color. So if you're trying to work like, say, North Light painting, that's a great thing to put white into the paint because it's going to cool your flesh tones quite dramatically. But when I tend to not work more North Light, I tend to work more incandescent or artificial light. And so I like to have a little bit warmer flesh tones. And so I'll start with my mixtures generally in the red and yellow family, and then I add in a complement to that to adjust it. So for instance, with painting Santa, because he is supposed to be, you know, jolly pink cheeks, I might even start with something really bright, like a bright pink like this. Maybe I'll throw some orange in there. Your basic flesh tone mixtures are going to be red, yellow, and white, quote unquote white. And depending on the subject of what you're painting, if they're darker skin or light skin or olive or redheaded or whatever their temperature of their skin, you know, like the local color of their skin, then you're going to pick different reds or yellows based on that. I almost always use yellow ochre as the yellow I put into my flesh tone. And then I add the white to it very slowly. So that's one way I can kind of avoid it getting too washed out, is I don't start with white, because it seems like once you start with a lot of white, you're constantly trying to put more in there. But once I've mixed my puddle up in sort of a middle value, then I incrementally add in this green, because the green also will act as a desaturation agent because it's complementary to oranges and reds. And you could do the same thing. You add white and then add a green, but I find it a little bit easier to get what I want with using a complement. So if I had somebody with very olive complected skin, someone with more yellows and greens in their skin, I would probably use purple as my, like a light color purple in this same value as my desaturation lightener. So, but yeah, a lot of people are afraid of, you know, don't use this color, you know, don't use black, don't use white. And there's really no such thing, honestly, if you kind of know the characteristic of the pigment you're choosing. I don't recommend, like, if you are new to portrait work, you don't probably need phthalo green on your palette because it is such a tough pigment to control. So obviously you want to pick pigments that are more user-friendly. But for me, I try to think primarily of complements when I'm working. So if something feels too much one way, then I add the opposite of it into the mixture to help kind of alleviate that issue. When I'm working on a small head, I always have a large head blow up, because it's very hard to see what you're doing in something that size scale, which is another reason, going back to the original question of do I prefer working from life or reference. The thing I like about working from reference is I can go into my computer and blow it up gigantic, and then I can adjust in Photoshop the values. So if I would need to lighten up an area to get more information out of it, I can do that. Or if I need to darken something to knock it back, I can do that in Photoshop and prep it that way. And that's a really great tool to get to use that you don't get to use in from life painting. I mean, yeah, maybe it makes me a lazier artist. I don't know, but it is just a wonderful, wonderful thing to get to do. I mean, from the beginning of my time here as an artist to where I am now, I've seen great technology. Like in the beginning, I would go out and shoot reference with a film camera, take it to Costco, get it developed, and hope that something would come out good enough to work from. But now with digital, I mean, it's just gotten so efficient and so wonderful that it's made the artist's life so much more enjoyable. You can literally, if I get a piece of reference and I go, oh, that hand doesn't look very good, I can just shoot my own hand right there and put that into Photoshop and adjust it and use that, rather than being stuck with some crummy little 5x7 image of something.
Armand wants to know if you have any different strategies for selecting different color gamuts for different scenes.
Generally, with color gamuts, I kind of go with what it tends to have the majority of, what it's closest to. But for instance, in this scene, I picked red and green as the complement scheme because it's very Christmassy. So I wouldn't pick yellow and purple and try to make it work. I think it would be really, really difficult and kind of arbitrary, and people wouldn't look at it right away and feel, oh, that feels like Christmas, because the colors are just so weird. So typically, I'll look at the image and say, what is the majority of the color balance in this image? Is it mostly in the green, or is there a lot of blue happening? And then I'll try to eliminate things that are just all over the place on the color wheel. Like I did a scene with a horse and carriage, and it was a tombstone scene. So it was set back in, kind of like the turn of the century or a little bit before the late 1800s. And it was very dusty. So I tried to pick a gamut that would represent the feel of that kind of gritty, earthy sort of scene. So sometimes I'll pick a gamut based upon what's easiest in the reference, like what is most common, or what is the most, what's the simplest thing I can pull from this piece of reference and get to work. But sometimes I'll pick a gamut that conveys another meaning to the painting. Like for instance, something really bright and colorful, I might pick for something in a youthful scene because I want that to convey youth, that bright springy feeling. Whereas if I was painting something more somber, I might go with a more tonal based gamut. But for this one, it was pretty easy. Just go with something that's a very holiday sort of theme. I mean, it doesn't mean I have to only do red and green for all my Santa paintings, but generally that's going to be a better sell for the client, because they want it to kind of, honestly, people buy artwork to match their decor, and I don't have a problem with that at all, and people shouldn't be ashamed about that. But most people like to decorate with the red and green theme during the holidays. But I have been contemplating kind of doing some slightly off gamuts, like, pink and mint green, because some people do variations of the red and green theme for their holiday tradition, or some people have like an all white, very tonal sort of theme for their holiday decor. And so you have to kind of think about that. If you want to sell your work, you kind of have to imagine where it's going to end up. And maybe some people would argue that that kind of cramps your style as an artist, but it doesn't to me. I like to sell my work. Not selling my work, that cramps my style more significantly than anything else. Like I did a show in September, and I tried to make sure I represented a variety of gamuts, because I have to kind of think, hey, this might suit this clientele, this might suit this clientele. I don't really know. I don't know the clientele, but I figure it's probably a safe bet to have a little bit of variety, because there's something for everybody out there. It's generally easiest to pick, though, what's going to be the simplest gamut. So even in the face, I'm using variations of red and green mixtures. It makes it easier when you're eliminating. I mean, it's basically the idea of a Zorn palette. It narrows your choices down. And so it just, you only have a few options. And it's just sort of a relief sometimes when you go, well, I have to get it to work with what I have. Whereas if you have an endless selection on your palette, that can just give you a lot more to worry about. Hey Jeff, how are you? Why, you're all dressed up. What's going on? Oh, very fancy. I don't know. And a very fancy wool coat. I know. See, now we need to pan the camera over. Everyone's like, what's he wearing? This side of the face, because it's going to be rolling away from us closer to the green backdrop. I want to work more greens into it anyway.
Mr. Mountain wants to know.
Is that a real name?
It's their screen name.
Oh, okay. I'm like, wow.
Another name than Mr. Mountain.
What does it say? Maybe it's a Game of Thrones thing or something.
He's just she is just starting out and is wondering, like, if you think there's any downside to him relying on the grid to put into the shapes, or if you think that it might affect his ability to judge relationships.
I think anytime you rely on gridding or using a projector in your early stages of training, it's probably not the best idea. This is my opinion. I think you're going to want to at least take some drawing classes before you use those tools. And I know they're kind of marketed towards the novice or the beginner, but I think it should be used the other way around. I don't think people who have zero experience drawing are going to be able to kind of sift through the reference and decide and make decisions about what would improve the painting. If they haven't really had any drawing experience previous to that, they're not going to really have a good judgment of that. So just relying simply on projection or gridding, in my opinion, is not the wisest move for a beginner, because you're not always going to have that opportunity to use a grid. Sometimes I do demoing from life, or I paint on location. I don't have a grid system to get me through that process. Also, as I'm working and I cover up my painting, that grid's no longer there. So if I don't know how to draw or fix problems in the paint, I'm going to be in big trouble. So in my opinion, I think it's better to use that when you have a more intermediate to advanced skill base, because you're going to be a much more well-rounded artist. I really like using a grid system because while I'm gridding it, I do make decisions in the drawing process as I'm drawing it in as to what I want to change. But I know I have that guidance or that guideline that everything is going to fit and be where it should be. So I don't have to worry, oh gosh, I'm going to run out of room and this little foot's going to come off the page, or I'm going to make something too big next to something too small. So I don't have to worry about that as much. But I probably trained for about 4 years before I started more exclusively using grid systems. I know they're marketed towards the beginner, but I think you probably want to be in a more intermediate place. You want to at least have some competence in drawing before you start using them exclusively. That's just my opinion. I just think as an artist, your motivation should be to be as well-rounded as possible. And while you might feel you don't have enough time to learn certain principles, drawing is the most basic, most important aspect of painting. People always think it's the color or moving the paint around or whatever, but it's actually the drawing. It's just so valuable. I mean, every decision you make is a bit of a drawing judgment. Is the value too light or too dark? Do I need to make the image? Is his head too big or too small? I mean, all those things are all drawing decisions. And very few good paintings are going to happen without good drawing skills. I mean, you may as well just do abstract painting at that point, where you're not going to be quite as critical of something as important as a baby toe related to a big toe. So that's my opinion. And I know that I might be alone in that opinion, but as a teacher, I want all my students to have a competence in drawing, because when they come into life painting class, they're not going to take a picture of the model and go and project it and then come back out and start painting it. They have to actually draw it all in by hand. And when they're in my costume painting class, even more so. They spend probably the first week of the pose just trying to get everything drawn in, and it's such a good skill to learn. It makes you such a good artist in the long run that I can't emphasize it enough. But I do understand the temptation to not have to worry about drawing, because I've heard people say that. I don't want to draw, I just want to paint. There really isn't any difference between those two things. When I started here, I didn't have any good drawing skills, especially not from life. I could probably sit down and kind of copy something very carefully, but I couldn't work from life. And not until I did, 2 years of head drawing did I even paint a decent portrait. So those two things went together. I feel very strongly about that.
Mr. Matthew wants to let you know that his real name actually means mountain.
Oh, really? I just thought he was a Game of Thrones fan, which is cool with me. I've got the mountain on there. I know that all the babies being born now are being named after TV shows. Yeah, there's like all the popular baby names. Or Arya, you know, they're all getting named after what's great on TV now. Another footnote with doing gridding is, say you're at an intermediate level of advancement in drawing, you can make your grid very, very loose. In other words, you can divide it just into a quadrant. You could divide it into 16 squares or rectangles. The more you divide it down, obviously the easier it's going to be. And for this particular painting, I really did use a lot of division, a lot of angles, because there's really small, very, very tiny expressions going on. So I want to make sure everything was where it should be approximately, because I knew it was going to give me trouble if I didn't have it well established from the beginning. But as an exercise, you can pull back on your grid. You can do just, you know, just a simple quadrant, and while that will ensure that things will basically fit, and you have to make sure they fit into that area, it's not going to be so divided that you're not having to engage in drawing on some level. So depending on what I'm painting, if it's just a portrait, I don't always even grid those at all. I just try to do those more freehand, just for practice. If it's a complicated portrait, say it's an Indian headdress that I'm painting, there I might do a 16 square grid. If it's something like a 4-figure painting with a ton of stuff going on, certain sections I might divide down into smaller sections, because I want to make sure that that information is going to be as correct as possible. So that's just a footnote with gridding, that you don't have to make it as complicated as this is. This is definitely probably one of my more complicated grids.
might be in pole position. Yeah, exactly. That's what I used to use it for. I understood that. All right, let's come on again. Is that Asia's child there?
Mr. Mountain wants to know what your thought process is for when you design shapes.
I have to admit, I'm probably not a very good, I think I know I'm not a very good shape designer. I'm pretty literal when I paint. So I try to always pick a model that I really like, their features, so I don't have to change very much, because I'm just not very comfortable with deviating dramatically from somebody's type. But like, for instance, as I'm working on this, like, I don't like how the pen, I'm not going to put the pen into the painting, and the pen is pulling the hat down and giving it this kind of goofy shape. So I'm going to change the shape on that. So little things like that, I'll make decisions in shapes. But I am probably a lot more literal than most people. Like, my husband will change things all the time. He's very comfortable doing that. I tend to be very careful. Like, I might slightly change an expression or eliminate things in a painting that makes somebody look older. If I'm trying to paint somebody with the youthfulness. So I'll do those kind of decisions in painting. But for the most part, when I'm creating shapes, I feel like I'm a lot more liberal or literal with it. I wish I was more liberal with it, but one regret I have is not getting to foray very much into illustration in my student days, because that kind of helps you explore that aspect of training. So that's also why I tend to do more illustration-based narrative paintings, because I'm trying to understand that skill, how to make a better design of something. But yeah, if I have a 2-story building, I'm not going to make it a 3-story building. That's just not going to happen. But little shapes, yes. Especially if I look at something in the reference and I don't love it. That's kind of comes down to my decision making. Do I like the way that looks? Not really. Okay, then I need to fix it. I have to ask myself, what do I not like about it? Usually it's an expression, like something about the corners of the mouth, or maybe the eyes are looking in the wrong direction, things like that. So I might have to make decisions about the shapes.
Dawn has a question about your brush choice. Do you normally prefer to paint with brights and flats?
Yes. Well, not brights. Long flats. That's about it. Long flats. I typically just use long flats, but then I use different bristle types. So I have long flats that are more sturdy. Like, these are, I've been using a lot of these rosemary ivories, which are like a synthetic hog hair. But I like them because they're a little firmer than a regular synthetic nylon, but they're not quite as bristly as a hog hair. And I think you should try to match your brush to your surface. So if you're using a finer surface, like this is pretty fine, you're probably not going to want to use an overly bristly brush unless you're trying to produce a lot of texture. Because if you have a bristly brush and a fine surface, it's going to pick all the paint back off. Whereas if you're using a very toothy surface, you tend to need a more substantial brush like a hog hair or something really scrubby, because it'll help get the paint to actually adhere to those nooks and crannies in the surface. So I tend to mainly favor the longer flats, because I like that I can kind of scoop up the paint on the tip and make a tile out of that. So that just sort of helps how I put down the paint stroke. I can do that with this type of brush. In the beginning, though, I used mostly hog hair filberts. So I don't use those really hardly at all, like ever anymore. So it's just interesting that, as you change your subject or change the degree of detail in a painting, you might find that you need a different brush, or even just change surfaces. I used to work on, in the very beginning, I worked on Fredericks Carlton, and that's very toothy. Like, I couldn't even imagine working on that right now. It's really bumpy. But I painted more still life paintings, and I like a little more tooth in there because it kind of lends itself to the aesthetic of what you're painting. Whereas if you're painting a little head and it's really toothy, they're just going to look like they have acne. And I don't like it. That's not my thing. If you have enough time to like build up 500 layers and smooth it all out, then a toothy surface might be more to your liking, but I don't want to do that. That's just tedious, and I get really irritated with bumpy orange peel texture in canvases, which seems to be pretty common. Typically, you know, if you get a cotton surface, it's going to be kind of bumpy. Linen tends to be a little bit nicer tooth for the most part. But yeah, I like these flats because I can control, you know, going back to kind of shape making and things like that, I can control these shapes a lot more, I feel, with this kind of a brush, because I can go in. I don't even have to draw lines necessarily. I can use it and just kind of step in a line shape. So that's what I like. I find them really versatile for me. But that's not what I started off with. So it is interesting that as you move through the painting process or change subject or change surface, you might find that, oh, these brushes don't really do it for me anymore. My favorite brushes are Langnickel's, but they don't make them anymore. Even though you sometimes used to get a batch of them that was really crummy. I have some Langnickel's that are probably at least 10 years old, and they're still going, so it's pretty impressive.
I have one that snapped in half.
Yeah, I know a lot of them were like, they would just like dump all their hair out, you know, like you like the first time you're using it, it was like they didn't crimp the ferrule right. I've honestly never ever had one do that to me, so that's probably why I like them. They've always been really good to me, and I like how they wear down. They kind of, like I have some that are wearing down to just like nothing now. I mean, they're just super tiny. And I tend to reach from, like I like these really long flats because they are flexible. So they will give you a different look in the painting. The brushstroke will look a little different than something that's a little firmer. So I don't use these as much unless I have actual enough paint on the surface to use them. But sometimes I'll come in and use them as a, you know, just a kind of softening brush. But I don't like to use them in the beginning of a painting because you have to use a lot of turpentine with them because they are really flimsy. And my whole thing is to use as little turp as possible because it never does me any favors by getting a lot of turpentine on there. Even when I do use a turp, I try to get as much of it out of the brush. If you use a lot of turp, it gives the illusion of something having a nice richness, and then when that turp evaporates, it will end up looking kind of dead sometimes because it makes the color a little richer, especially in your darks. Also, if you use a lot of turp, it will creep up into your ferrule on your brush and then ooze itself back out when you least expect it. So it just like takes a poop on your painting sometimes. With some arbitrary color, you're like, oh great, how am I going to get rid of that now? So that's something I've found with excessive use of terp, is that it just makes a slippery mess of everything. And it's very hard to control wet into wet painting if you have a lot of turpentine going on.
A Big Meow wants to know if you ever use mediums or clove oil.
I do not use clove oil because I don't like the smell of it. And the other problem I have with clove oil is I typically tend to be in a hurry with the painting to ship it off to the gallery. And I don't want to ship it wet because sometimes the clove oil will prevent drying for a very long time. And you risk somebody smearing it or messing it up when they just unwrap it. So I typically don't ever use clove oil. But sometimes I use what's called Liquin Gel Light. And it's kind of, it's like a better version of the regular Liquin. And I use that when I'm working on a painting that has a lot of darks in it because it helps retain some of the richness of those darks. And also it has a bit of a drying agent in it and a glossy agent in it. So it just helps that process when I have to ship something off to the gallery. It helps the painting set up a little bit more. And because in one of my galleries, the owner he and his son run the gallery, and he's pretty elderly, I guess, to put it nicely. And he's kind of messed up a few of my paintings just unboxing them. So I've become really like careful about all that, like make sure it's dry to the touch, you know, double wrap it, you know. So I don't know. I mean, it's harder when you're getting in your 80s. You probably don't have the same touch as when you're young, but yeah, I've had to have them ship the paintings back and fix them. So now I try not to ship something that's super sopping wet. So I tend to use that medium when I'm in a tight deadline. I'm always in a tight deadline, it seems like, but I mean, I wish I was the kind of artist that really planned things out. I have a show next year, and I need to be painting for it right now, but I'm already painting for my other gallery right now. So I'm already behind on that other gallery. Even though the show's in June, it's like I should have been painting last month on it. Yeah, I don't know. I know there's artists that they have their work planned out and it's ready, you know, it's already been sitting there for 6 months so they can safely varnish it, and they're just really good people. I don't know. I'm just not one of those kind of artists, I guess.
Do you take commission work as well?
I hate commission work. Is that an answer?
Yeah.
How about reluctantly when I get bullied into it? Like I'm having to do another Santa painting at home for a relative. Ugh. If it wasn't Santa, I would just be like, no, I'm not doing it. But because I like painting Santa paintings, I'm doing it. And because my other two cousins have one, and now this other cousin wants one because they can't be left out, I feel like, okay, I've been guilted into it. And I've done a series of Annie Oakley paintings for my gallery up north. And I did one, and somebody really liked it, so they made me do another one. And yeah, I could say no, but then you just look like a total jerk. So I don't put that out there because I don't like doing commissions. I really don't, which is another reason why I probably wouldn't be a very good illustrator, because you really are kind of a commission. You get the job ahead of time. You know the payment you're going to get for it, and so in the back of your mind the whole time when you're working, you're like, I'm hoping this art director likes my painting. I hope they don't reject it. And that's how I feel when I'm working on a commission. I feel different about the whole painting process. I feel like, oh, they're going to hate this painting. I pretty much work myself up into this big ball of nerves. And I mean, most of it's just in my head, but it just doesn't make the process go smoothly. Whereas if I pretend I'm just painting for myself and the painting doesn't come out very good, I only really hurt my own feelings. I don't make my cousins cry or anything like that. So, I mean, like all I can think about now when I'm working on the Santas, what if she doesn't like her Santa as much as she likes her cousin's Santa, and then they're gonna think I did it on purpose. And I mean, it's stupid. That's the stuff that I don't need to be spending my thought process on. But I guess I just don't have the chops for that kind of work. I just don't. Like, I know people who have come to the school and from the beginning they're like, I want to be a portrait painter and I want to paint portraits for commission. And I'm like, you know what? Honestly, if that was my only choice, I would not be an artist. I just wouldn't. There's just no way. I just would have very little pleasure of that field. I just couldn't do it. I'd just give up. So it's probably a good thing I'm not in that kind of field. I think it just takes a much better constitution with healthier self-esteem to do that kind of work, and I'm not that person.
What palette do you recommend for a complete beginner?
I think the best palette is Zorn palette, personally, for a complete beginner, because you get really good experience using temperature. And most people would recommend monochrome palette, and that's also good, but to really kind of sink your teeth into painting, I feel like the Zorn palette's going to give you the most bang for your buck. It's probably the safest palette as far as what problems you can run into when making flesh tone mixtures. And I feel it's a palette you can add to and get more out of. Whereas with a monochrome palette, once you've kind of mastered it, you kind of just leave it behind for the most part. You're not probably going to continue to use it. You're not going to really be able to judge temperature with it. To me, one of the most important parts of color is temperature, and you don't get that from monochrome painting. Monochrome painting is great in terms of just getting a feel for how the paint behaves and for, understanding value and edges, things like that. Yeah, you can really manipulate it and make nice, beautiful black and white or blue and white or any color, any monochrome color you pick. You will get a lot out of it, but it's not something I think you're going to be able to just use as a leaping point into your lifelong palette. And when I train my students, I'm always advocating setting things up, using the best materials, setting up your palette the same way consistently. So you have basically that all out of the way and mastered. And so that way when you have your subject, you're just focused on that, and you're not having to battle odd things like a weird paint choice that you made that day, or funky brushes, or a bad canvas. Those are all things you just want to have out of the way. So I feel like the Zorn palette is just an amazing palette. And I even go back and use it periodically. Or what I do is I do a Zorn plus 1 or 2, where I take the Zorn palette and I add 1 or 2 pigments to it that will help it with enhancing the subject I'm painting. Like if I was painting a portrait, but they had on a teal scarf, I might decide to add a Viridian or a blue to the actual Zorn palette. So I'd take the Zorn palette and add 1 color to it. So it just sort of stretches it out, and it's still pretty safe. The irony is with beginning students is they market these student grade paints and student grade palette choices for you, and they're actually like the biggest obstacle course you'll ever run into, because they're typically inexpensive pigment paints. They're not giving you real cadmiums or real Viridians, so they're giving you phthalos and alizarin or quinacridone based pigments, which are great. There's nothing wrong with them, but they're not the most user friendly when you're new. Whereas a Zorn palette, the only color you have to really worry about, like as far as saturation, is your cad red. Other than that, you don't have to worry about a tiny bit of phthalo blue coming in and just ruining all your mixtures, which it will guarantee to do. And those student palettes, that's what they consist of, because it's inexpensive. So I strongly recommend Zorn palette. I think it's just a beautiful palette. I think you can use that to kind of form a voice for yourself, and then add to it as you feel confident. And I push a lot of my students into using it even before they want to, because when I see somebody has a good technical drawing skill ability, I instantly push them into Zorn palette. Generally people who are very methodical about how they learn something. They kind of want to ease into using it. But you know, if you're in my portrait class and we're using colorful lighting and you're using monochrome, you're just not going to be able to do much with that. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just if you have a good drawing skill set, there's no better way to learn how to paint, unless you actually use paint. There's nothing wrong with it. I mean, I learned how to paint with acrylic. God forbid, that was just god awful. So I don't recommend that to anybody. What Zorn palette is, honestly, for Zorn palette, I recommend Cad Red Medium, and I know I might be the only one that says that. I'm just going to say that right now. I prefer Cad Red Medium, Winsor Newton Cad Red Medium for the Zorn palette, because the red is just a little bit more in the middle of the color wheel, whereas the Cad Red Light is almost orange, and so you cannot get hardly any good murky purples out of it. I mean, no matter what, you're going to get a murky purple with Zorn palette because the red has so much cross-contamination with yellow in it. But if you're using an orange-based red, it's really going to make everything poopy, just like the poopiest purple you ever saw. So I highly recommend a really good yellow ochre like the Gamblin or Da Vinci. Or if you're going to use Winsor Newton yellow ochre, you have to get their yellow ochre light. Do not use their regular yellow ochre because it is a brown. If you're not using a quality yellow ochre that's a little bit of a cleaner yellow, you're not going to get the best use of your Zorn palette. So I recommend you can use ivory black, Cad Red Medium, a good yellow ochre, and a titanium white. Some people even add a blue black to their palette, which is a nice sort of way to flesh it out a little bit more, because the safety net with the Zorn palette is you can't get overly cold colors with it, which you don't really need a lot of in portrait painting for the most part. But at the same time, if you're trying to get something that has a little bit of a blue quality or a purpley quality, using things that have all the cross mixtures on the color wheel is going to make it brown. So I prefer a Cad Red that's more towards the medium Cad than towards the light. And some companies' Cad Red lights are a Cad Orange. They're just straight up Cad Orange. So you have to kind of look at what you're buying. And what I have heard is that in the old days when they used vermilion, which is a very, very costly pigment now, it's dangerous, it's made out of mercury, but I was told that the vermilion is a little bit more in the center of reds. It's not quite as orange biased. So if that's true, then it makes sense to me to use a red that's as close as possible to what Zorn would have been using back in the time. So that's my little rant about that.
It's really like brand dependent too.
What is?
I feel like it's really brand dependent.
It's very brand dependent. And the thing is, when you're buying paint, unless you know what you're buying, when you're new to buying paint, don't just look at the label on the paint, because the label it's not always printed. It's never printed with the actual pigment. So the label's printed with a, CMYK printer's palette of color, and then the pigment itself is completely different. So I always open up the cap, even though you're not supposed to do that, and I do it when they're not looking. Because at the art store, they're like, oh, you're going to open the cap and ooze it out everywhere, and it has happened to me. So you have to be really stealth about it. But honestly, I open it up and look at it, because I have been completely fooled by what the label says and what's inside the paint. And so that's just my thing. And you've got to be aggressive about, protect yourself.
Williamsburg actually puts the paint on their label.
Let me see if I didn't bring any Williamsburg, but here's a great example. This is my favorite pigment, my transparent maroon. Look at this light. See that? That's brown. And then you open it That's not even, I mean, they're not even in the same universe, so it's pretty ridiculous. This, it doesn't convey that it's transparent. This has a kind of a purpley brown red to it. That looks like, you know, Indian red. I don't know what's going on with that. That couldn't be farther apart. So that's why I do that, even though you shouldn't do it. So don't say I told you to do it. Just know that that's what I do. And I seriously am surprised. People come in with a pigment and then they open it and they go, that's not what I thought I was getting. And one brand will say cad yellow light, another brand will call it cad lemon, and you don't know what you're getting unless you look at it. So I've had a student where I'll say, hey, I need a cad lemon. And they'll go, well, I have cad yellow pale, and I'll look at it and go, that's the same color as your other cad yellow light. Like, oh yeah, I guess I have the same color. And I'm like, you don't have a cad lemon on your palette, so you don't know these things. You know, you can't just trust, because they don't have a consistency across the brands in labeling, so you don't know exactly what you're getting until it's too late.
You have EM Gist saying, looking great, honey.
Yeah, is he eating bonbons and watching Marvel flicks?
The trailer came out today.
Huh?
The new trailer came out today
Uh-oh.
for Avengers.
Oh, I bet he's already watched that, guaranteed. Yeah.
Is that Remy in the picture?
No, that's my sister's. My sister's Boston. No. I haven't used, Remy's just too big. I don't even think Santa could pick him up. He's just way too heavy. I took him in to get his picture with Santa, and he was kind of scared of Santa, so that didn't go as well as I had hoped. I mean, I got one good picture, that was about it. But you know what? He was way braver than all the other dogs in the pet store, because the bigger dogs were really scared of Santa. They just like threw themselves on the ground and didn't even want to get near him. So here I'm actually using a, I guess this is a filbert. I don't know, it's hard to tell. It's a Lang nickel. I think it's technically a round, but honestly, like their sizing and what they say it is completely different than any other brand. But because I want to just barely tap in some little tiles, I've gotten a round out. And I wouldn't typically use a round on a bigger painting very much unless it's to sign my name or to do something very, very tiny. Yeah, I generally don't use a lot of rounds. Whereas I think my husband uses quite a few rounds in his work, but he paints heads much smaller than this all the time, and I don't know how he does it, but it's very difficult. Cookies.
Then he got cold.
You have a cold?
He said he has a sore throat.
Oh, you gotta use apple cider vinegar. Gargle with apple cider vinegar. I guarantee you it'll feel better.
And then I get a little bit sick, and then I go to sleep, and I wake up the next day and I'm fine.
Until you're really sick. Ah, that sounds like denial.
No, it's been that way since like 6th grade or so.
Really? So you've just been sick since 6th grade? Jeez.
Yeah, it's pretty old.
Brian's immune system.
I don't know. I didn't get sick for like 4 years, so then when you do, you go, whoa, this sucks.
I haven't been like really sick since high school, maybe, like beginning of high school.
It's pretty good. Like my nephews, they were born without, I guess it's IgA or something like that, which is something that your immune system produces to help combat against colds. And they get sick like literally 12 to 15 times a year. Yeah, it's a lot. Probably. I mean, people they also have celiac, so it's like, you know, when you have one autoimmune condition, and there's other ones that kind of crop up with it.
My immune system doesn't like me.
That's because you go to those conventions. The most sick I've been in the last like 5 years is because I went to Comic-Con.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I had to go in and get antibiotics and everything because I had this cough that wouldn't go away for 2 months, and it was from the Comic-Con, and it's a cesspool of unhygienic people.
Got the
Yeah.
con plague.
Yeah, that's what everyone called it, and I was like, man, it is just horrible. They gave me a Z-Pack, and everything was better after that. But you know, when you take the antibiotics, then it's like you destroy everything in your body, and so they're not good for you. But it was like Eric and I were coughing for 2 straight months, so every night it would just be this big coughing fest, so we weren't getting any sleep. So then they gave us this wonderful codeine cough syrup.
Oh, the Canadian kind.
It was great. Oh, I don't know. I guess I went off on a Jeff tangent. I don't know.
Jeff doesn't give health advice.
No, he doesn't give health advice. I don't dare go there. I know, I'm not an expert. I always talk about health stuff. Because artists don't typically take very good care of themselves, and it's sort of a sedentary occupation. So when I have a young student and I'll ask them, hey, do you work out? No? Uh-oh, that's a problem. Because it just helps your artwork so much to stay physically active. Because this is such a, you get the sitting disease just sitting here. Sometimes I just sit in my studio for 6 hours, and now I have like 2 chair pads. I'm like, okay, that's terrible that my body is atrophying this quickly.
What's your workout routine?
Well, I've been doing Pilates for a couple years now, and I definitely love it. I feel like it's a good way to kind of counterbalance what you do in painting, which is a constant sort of scrunched up position, and in there you work more on elongating your muscles and working on your core. And it's pretty gentle, so you don't have to worry about injury. So it's a good thing you can do when you're, getting older like me. Because that's another thing. When you are younger, you can be a little bit more extravagant in your workout. You could do CrossFit and things like that. But when you start to get a little older, the return for what you're putting into it can come at a cost, and injuries are the worst thing that can happen to you. My whole objective is to be able to, consistently work out and not have an injury sabotage that. And I used to do a lot of running, and I'm kind of what they call the Clydesdale category of runners, which is not the nicest term, but it's true. You're not really built. Some people just don't have that like lithe, springy build like an antelope, so a little harder on your body. And then I injured my, my AC, I can't remember the name of it, but ITB. I got an ITB injury, and that just made running so unfun. But if I'm having trouble in a painting and I go and work out, I come back and it just seems like, I can think straight again. I can see things more objectively. It's like you're getting all the circulation to flow through your body, and now you can come back to your painting and look at it objectively, which is the most important aspect of being a studio painter, is to see your work objectively. It's very easy to get tunnel vision with what you're doing, and you're just kind of in your own little universe. It's one of the reasons why I like teaching, because it does make me get out of the house and interact with people and see other examples of artwork and also do problem solving on other kinds of paintings, and it just gives me a little bit of a refresh, because it's very easy as an artist to become almost a hermit. And for the most part, it's a very solitary field, and I like that about it. I like that it's, you know, something you do with your thoughts and on your time, and there's a certain beauty to that, you know, that you're alone, but you're not, because you're kind of married to your image at that time, and it's a very nice thing. But then you can get a little weird if you spend too much time alone, so it's good to interact with normal people again. So I'm just whittling these shapes. Start with the larger shapes. Start with the darkest shapes first, because I find that when you're working wet into wet, if you just kind of emphasize your drawing in the darks, that'll kind of hold the place for when you start working more alla prima, because the problem you run into working alla prima, stuff just feels like it's sliding everywhere, and now you've lost all that drawing and all that time you put into the drawing. So I like to work with those graphic shapes first. Essentially, like when you do a 2-value block in a drawing, it's the same principle in a painting. And I tell my students to kind of think of each stage of the painting as a finished image in that stage. So for instance, not neglecting one thing so grossly that by the time you get to the end of that painting, you can't even get to that anymore because you're out of time. Like say an ear. You've been painting the face the whole time in class, and then the timer goes off and you didn't paint their ear. Well, that's kind of a problem, because it just is going to be the only thing you see in the painting is an unfinished ear. So that's what I recommend to people, is to work with your larger graphic shapes and leave things finished in an unfinished state, which may not make a lot of sense, but to think of it almost as you work the whole stage and then you work the next stage. So if you have a lot of time, then you can complete a lot of stages in the painting and make a very detailed painting. But if you have less time, then you have it completed to a halfway point, but there's no loose end, nothing that's just like dangling and bothering you in the painting. Ideally, you would cycle through all areas of the painting, but you want to spend more cycles, obviously, on the things that are important in the painting. But it doesn't mean you want to just grossly neglect something in a painting to the point where it's going to come back and haunt you. And I mention ears because that's a thing I have seen in class, or backgrounds aren't even like stained in or anything, and then the timer goes off. And it's like you could have been utilizing that background the whole time to help guide you with some of your choices you're making. And you didn't. So now you've got to kind of figure out how to get something in there quickly so the painting doesn't feel like it's just a bobblehead floating in space. I mean, even something as simple as a vignette on the page for a portrait can be so crucial to a painting's success. And that's something you can do in, the first 30 seconds of the lay-in. Whereas if you don't plan that out in that, as part of your painting, it will come back to bother you.
Do you ever get art blocked?
Art blocked. Yeah, I don't know if I get so much art blocked or if I just get tired and a little less inspired, I guess would be something I run into. But honestly, more typically, I have the other problem where I feel I have more ideas and excitement than I do time left in my life. And that, I don't know, is that as bad as being art blocked? I don't know. It's frustrating. So if I run into an art block, it's usually a frustration one where I go, I'm not going to have the time to develop that the way I want to. Like I was mentioning earlier, I wish I would have done some illustration and, things as a student that I wish I could just go back and spend a little more time on. And I don't have that time now. I've already kind of started where my path is going, and I don't have, a year to go back and do things that would probably make me a better artist in the long run. But, I'm getting old. I'm set in my ways more. So, and yeah, I tend to run into more problems with feeling like the frustration of having more ideas than time. But sometimes I procrastinate because what I'm going to be working on is intimidating. So I don't know if that's an art block, maybe that is, but it's more just the fear of the unknown, and that is really frustrating. So I won't get working on something that I should be doing, even though I've got a deadline, because I'm afraid I'm going to fail at it. So yeah, I know there's people who experience a lot of blocks in their journey, and I guess I do too. But maybe mine are just a little of a different kind. I don't know. Yeah, I'm just very easily frustrated. So that's probably my worst enemy in painting. And one of the things I've learned to do more, in the last few years of painting is to accept that I may only have a little bit of time to work on something. And it's better to just to spend a little time on something than to expect to have an entire day laid aside to do a specific task in painting. I found I've been a lot more productive in painting when I just commit to just a small segment of time. And I really don't want to force myself to paint, 6 hours a day every day. I don't do particularly well at that schedule for very long. I mean, I can do it when I have to, but I don't think it's particularly healthy. And I start to get resentful. And now that I paint a little less, but I paint more consistently, I just truly enjoy and love the process more. Well, that's just something that I've learned in myself. But everybody's different. My husband, he has to kind of do something every day, or he gets bored, I guess is what he says, if he doesn't paint or draw or do something every day. Whereas I might even not paint for a month or two because I'm working on other aspects of art, like working on the photo shoot I'm going to be doing, or making costumes for a photo shoot I'm going to be doing, or planning out a series of paintings. So sometimes I don't paint for a few weeks at a time, and then when I get back to it, I just love it. I'm totally excited. So maybe that helps prevent some of those blocks because I'm giving myself a little time to recuperate. Like I did a show in September, and I had painted for at least 4 months straight, just every day consistently. But I was starting to get really tired at the end and just kind of felt like, just make it stop. And so then after that, I did a big photo shoot, and then now I've been doing some Santa painting. So I've kind of switched subject matter for a little bit of it, and I'll be going back to that other subject matter probably in January, and then I'll probably be painting for 6 months straight. But so the life of an artist, you don't always get to pick when things come your way. It's one of those things you got to always kind of be ready, be prepared. Don't rest on your laurels. Because I've had times when my work is selling very quickly in the gallery, and I've had times where it just sits around and nothing's happening. And it's just one of those weird things. You don't always know how to predict that market. I had a gallery that closed on me many, many years back, and I was painting the colonial subject matter. So then when I found a different gallery, they actually asked me to change my subject matter. And I was like, all right, I guess I have nothing to lose since, you know, my new gallery wasn't able to really sell the colonial work as well. It was the wrong market. So I said, sure, I'll try a different subject matter. And I'm glad I did, because they were able to move that work a lot more, and it's helped propel me, keep me going. And for me, selling, I'm not, you know, I don't sell a lot. I don't like make all my income from selling artwork, but it does motivate me to be able to afford to do the photo shoots and do everything else that I want to do, fly to locations. So if I'm selling my work, I can justify the cost of doing those things. But if I'm not selling my work, it's very hard to justify the materials for just the costuming alone. So yeah, you have to kind of look at, you know, at least breaking even for quite a bit of it. Sometimes I just break even, but I'm happy with that because I love doing it. And I want to do it to my quality. Yeah, I could make more of a profit if I wanted to lower the quality of my costumes or my reference gathering, but that's like one of the things I love doing the most about painting is that aspect of it. So I really don't want to make that something that is just an afterthought. Everyone's different. I mean, I feel like you're very blessed if your subject matter is, say you want to paint the modern person, people on the street. I mean, you have a wealth of material for next to nothing right there. So that's just fantastic. And it's good people are painting that for, you know, eternity, because 20 or 30 years people say, oh, I remember that fashion movement, or I remember when that was a big thing. And it's just kind of cool to look back through paintings and see. Like, I've actually studied paintings to find out how to do costumes. A lot of the colonial stuff I was doing, they didn't have descriptions of seams and seam lines and cutting patterns, and just by looking at paintings I've been able to figure out how to create something, because a lot of those artists back in that time period painted everything that they saw. Like, they painted every little stitch and seam line, and it's preserved that because those garments hardly exist now. So through painting, they've been able to document something that is, you know, kind of a historical thing. And I think that's super cool.
Shade wants to know about if you've ever considered marketing your work online versus having galleries.
That's a question that I think a lot of artists are in a position to do. For me, I don't want to do it because that will take a lot of time away from painting. I already spend probably more time doing the reference aspect of the painting than the actual painting part of the painting. So if I had to also find the clients and do all the networking, that would probably take up 100% of my time. And even though I have to give the gallery 50% of my sales, they have done the legwork to get the clients, and they connect the artwork to the right person, and they have like a database of, you know, thousands and thousands of clients. So for me, even though it costs me money to be in a gallery, I feel like I'm benefiting from it. Now, if that ceases to be the case and they no longer are moving my work, or clients are actually seeking me out for specific things, then, you know, that may not be something I have to do down the road. But at this point, I would rather send the artwork off, let them deal with that, and sell it to somebody. And I like that they are the liaison and I don't have to do it, because again, I kind of go to that, like, getting very personal with who connects to your artwork. I kind of like to not get personal about it. I know people will say, oh, aren't you sad to let go of that painting? Hell no, I'm glad to see that thing gone. I don't want to look at it anymore. I don't even like that painting anymore, and I'm on to the next one. It's like a love affair gone wrong, and you're just ready to move on. And that's kind of how I feel. Like, once you get it out of your system, then you're ready to move on to the next creation. And I'm hoping, it gets into someone's home and they fall in love with it, because I don't love it anymore. I'm kind of sick of looking at it. So, yeah, I just like the idea that they're this anonymous person that just falls in love with the painting and they're so happy to have it. When the truth is, sometimes I think maybe they get the painting and they go, the husband might like it, but the wife's like, I don't really like that painting. You can put it in your man cave or put it in your back office, and that's probably more the reality. And I don't really need to think about that. I don't want to know if they weren't in love with it, because I can have this, fantasy life that they fell in love with the painting and it's like the best thing in their house, and it's probably not any of that. That's just my ego or something like that. I'm probably not your typical artist. I go back to that question about commission work, and I think that also answers that yeah, I just don't want to really personally know. And I know that's an important part of artwork, and I have another gallery where they want me to be there at the show because they want the people want to meet me. Then they ask me about the painting, and then I'm put on the spot. I have to think of an elaborate reason for why I painted it, because it just makes them feel good about purchasing it. And it's just weird. I don't know. It's just a really weird thing that I feel I'm just too awkward, I guess. I don't know. Some people thrive in it, and others just kind of like to be behind the scenes, and I'm definitely more stay behind the scenes. So you want to make sure when you're doing gridding that your image size and your canvas size are the exact same proportion. If they are not, you will absolutely not be able to do it. So for instance, this is a square format, and so I have to make sure my image is exactly square. So if I had an 8x10, I need to find out the ratio, which that's a 4:5 ratio. So if I'm working on a painting that's, let's see, a 20x30, no wait, 20x25. Let's see, 4:5, okay, whatever. So if I'm working on a 16x20, I can make an 8x10 printout, and that'll be the exact same proportion because they're both 4:5. Or if I'm working on a 20x30, I can do a printout that's a 2:3 ratio. So I could do a 4:6 printout, and that'll be the exact same proportion. The problem people run into when they grid is that they have, maybe a slightly weird proportion, like a 24x32, and they don't calculate what size they can print out, the maximum size they can print out. That's the exact same ratio. So you have to create the ratio to make sure they're both the same exact ratio. Otherwise, the process won't work, because you have to make sure that this size square or rectangle is the exact size ratio as what you have. And then all I simply do is just take my image and divide it into 16 segments. So I just do the quarter, and then I divide that into quarters. If something's very complicated, then I run angles through it and divide it into, you can keep dividing it into further quarters if you choose to. But again, I would say do that with caution. You want to try to make sure you're keeping things as large in terms of your gridding as possible, so that way you're kind of involved in the drawing process as well. But yeah, that's the key thing. I had somebody come in, and we were doing a studio class, and so in that class we were gridding, and they came in, they had just a slightly off printout to their grid, so when they transferred all the lines, it was warped. Yeah, it was like all weird. I'm like, what is going? They're like, I don't know what's going on with the image. I'm like, even though you're transferring what's in, you're copying or drawing what's in that square to there, if this is not the same ratio, now you're essentially like taking something in Photoshop and squishing it or stretching it. So yes, you have to be completely 100% on board with it being the exact same ratio. So that's the first thing you have to do before you divide it. It's very simple, I just whatever I printed out at, I just get my ruler out and mark off the halfway points and divide it up. And you have to be pretty accurate with it because, especially on small scale, any inaccuracy is going to show up and raise its ugly head.
Do you ever use a projector?
I don't like projectors. Several reasons why I don't like a projector. The first being is that it's really hot under the projector, and so my whole thing is just to get out of there as fast as possible, so I'm really sloppy. I've only done projections like a few times in my life, and every time I've done it, I've rushed it so much that when I came out, I had skewed the panel, and so the projection was at an angle, and it was just a total rookie, dumb move to make. That's because I just don't like being in there and rushing. The other thing I don't like about projecting is that I don't tend to interact with the drawing when I projected it because I just feel that, oh, it's perfect. It has to be perfect because I projected it. I don't have to worry about the drawing. Whereas when I grid, I know I make mistakes, so I'm always double checking everything that I'm doing to make sure it's correct. But with a projection, I don't. I just go, hey, I gotta, get out of drawing card free, and I don't have to worry about it. But then you run into a lot of problems when you have that mindset. So for me personally, I don't project for that reason because A, I try to rush and it's sloppy, and B, because I get really lazy with it. And I think it's just not good for my personality or my temperament. But Jeff, like Jeff just loves projecting. He gets in there and he does this amazing projection that he completely covers up. I mean, he does this great, this gigantic paisley expanse, and every little tiny thing is tiled, and he loves the ritual of doing it. And I'm the complete opposite about it. Like, I don't even like doing the gridding. I just want to get into the painting. I just don't like that aspect. But when I do my grid, I know I'm going to have problems to solve. So I'm constantly checking and making sure and correcting as I go because I can't get lazy with it or I run into all kinds of problems.
Bobby wants to know, do you ever squint when you're looking at your subjects, and how do you translate that, like what you see when you squint, into your choices?
So squinting for me is an absolute, it's an absolute thing I have to do. I don't do it the way other people do it though, because most people are telling you, squint, squint from the beginning, squint down, see the shapes. I don't squint until I've got something down. The reason I squint is because I paint in a very, very, very tiny space. It's about 6 feet by 6 feet. I can't get back from my artwork very far. I sit in a chair, so I don't stand back from my work enough to look at it. So when I squint at something, it's to basically get distance from the image. So I have to have something down first. Like now I'll start squinting at what I'm painting because I want to see what looks funny when I squint. If something's like really jarring or high contrast or a funny looking shape, when I squint, it's almost at the advantage of like getting some distance from your work. It's like when you go to lunch and come back to your painting, good God, what was I thinking? It's a total train wreck. Squinting for me does that. It can just kind of tell me, oh gosh, this shape's really harsh, or that value is totally off, or that's just an ugly shape I made, and it just gives you that advantage. But that's why I squint, is because I don't have any space in my studio at all.
So rather than the thing you're painting, you're squinting at the painting itself?
I squint at that. I don't squint at this. I know I should. But I would also say, I don't like how squinting feels on my face. It's really uncomfortable, and then I think I'm just gonna get lots of crow's feet if I do it a lot. So it's a vanity thing. Like I'm just like, I'm gonna have to go get some Botox if I squint at this painting too much. So yeah, it's
an art investment, the Botox.
I haven't tried it yet, but I have been tempted, but I'm a little concerned. You want Botox?
Yeah, I'm ready.
I mean, I've heard some horror stories, so yeah, it's totally kind of kept me from doing it. But I have heard that people have done it in their forehead and it makes it nice and relaxed. So maybe you think you're squinting, but you're really not. I don't know. Does it really maybe I can't squint because I've got this Botox now. I don't know. I don't want to affect my ability to squint like I can.
You can cure jowls with Botox. Like they put it in your neck and you don't have jowls anymore.
Well, I know you can, for TMJ, people that grind, like I grind my teeth.
Oh, yeah.
And so you can inject it, but then what it does is it kind of changes your face shape because the muscles atrophy that were formerly kind of pumped up. So if you had kind of a square jawline, it tends to become more oval because you're no longer using those muscles anymore. So yeah, you might like the effect of that, and you may not like that, depending on, if you like having a strong jaw. So yeah, I don't know. And then it's like you are literally putting poison in your body, and I don't know. It's like I'm not anti, but I'm also, I'm holding out as long as possible.
I know Ben always tells people to squint, but then he doesn't do it, and I'm like, well, what are you doing instead? And he's just like, I look up really quickly and then I look away.
I don't know, because when I see him, he always has raccoon eyes, like he's been just, and you can see the lines, yeah, like in his eye, like because he goes in plein air paints, and I think
That's how he stopped doing it.
is that why he's like, his wife's probably like, Ben, you're getting crow's feet, yeah. I don't know. I've heard of people having really adverse reactions to it, so people getting like semi-paralysis all over the place. So yeah,
Scary.
it's kind of scary, all for pretty much a vanity thing. But it's like as an artist, you sometimes have to go to those events and get all dolled up, and people like expect like you to look like this glamorous artist. It's really weird. Like
You're an artist.
you're an artiste, and it's like, dude, I just. Okay. It's like I just paint in my pajamas all day, and that's my glamorous life.
Maybe it's not hookers and blow.
No, it's not hookers and blow. No, there's just I can't afford that. That's an expensive hobby.
Alan wants to know if there's a reason you didn't use underpainting.
I rarely use underpaintings. When I'm painting more outdoor scenes, I might do like all the background environment. I might scrub that in as just sort of a value pattern in there. Like technically, I guess part of this is sort of an underpainting where I've established the shapes of something, and then I have several more layers to put on top of it. But for this particular painting, especially on the figures, I've been painting them more wet into wet. Sometimes I like to work in layers. So like in the environment, I like the idea of kind of coming in and working on different levels of finish. So it'll allow me to do one pass and wait a week, come back in and texture something in there. So it kind of depends upon if I'm looking for a certain kind of texture that I can't achieve wet into wet, or if I'm just basically trying to kill the white of the canvas and just get that glaring issue out of the way. But when I'm painting these little heads and little intricate details, I do like to work them a little bit more wet into wet because they are just so tiny and delicate that if I let it dry and then I go back in a couple days later to paint on it, the little texture that's on there can interfere with later layers. So I do try my best to kind of paint on these particular examples while they're still wet. But yeah, I wouldn't say I'm a real underpainting kind of painter. But I experiment. Sometimes I'll do tonal blocking, or sometimes I'll do a complement color underneath something. So that way when I put the next layers on, that they have that little bit of pop. Kind of just depends on the experimental field I feel like going into. When you kind of are sort of set in your ways as a painter, the things you do to get better and improve are in a much narrower field. So like I'll set a goal, and that might be something I work on for at least a year, maybe 2 to 3 years. Whereas when you're a student, you're new, you're learning so many new things at once. You're just like a sponge, and you're just seeing these exponential gains for everything you learn, and it goes very quickly. But then when you get to a certain point, you start to see things slow. And it's not that you're not learning a lot, you're just having to really get better at a tiny thing, and that can take a long time to really fine-tune something. So now that's more where I am. Like when I say I'm working on color gamuts, well, I said I would do that this year, but I've decided that I'll probably be doing them next year because I haven't felt like I got everything out of it yet. So I don't mind looking at things that way. It's kind of exciting. It like gives you permission to improve one little thing at a time. And when you are no longer a student and you are a professional, you can sometimes feel a little trapped by where you are and you feel like I can't get better. I don't have the time. It's sort of a catch-22. I want to get better, but I don't have the time to get better. So you have to do things in more creative ways to get better. Like, yes, I wish I could go back and do illustration. Well, my solution is I'll do paintings that are a little bit more illustrative, that have a narrative content to it. That way I'm kind of sneaking into that aspect, but on my terms. And hopefully, the gallery's not going to think, these look like you're trying to experiment into a foray of illustration rather than, hopefully they're not noticing that. Because now I kind of think I have to kind of get paid to do things because I have to make a living at stuff. It's not fun being an adult.
They find a market for that, they wouldn't complain.
Well, they are the ones that asked me to do Santa painting. I had done Santa paintings just for myself, and on a whim, I put one in my Etsy shop just for total kicks, and it sold immediately. And for some reason or somehow, my gallery saw an image, or they went to my blog or something, and they called me and said, "Hey, can you get us a Santa painting?" And I'm like, "Why? You're not going to be able to. That's not fine art, And boy, was I wrong. There's definitely a market for nostalgia that people collect. And there's people that literally leave their holiday decorations up year-round. Those are the people I want. They're kind of weird, but honestly, for the artist, you need weirdos to buy your artwork. Because who else wants something so specific that they're willing to spend that kind of money on hanging up in their home? It has to be somebody who's a little weird. Because honestly, the people I don't want collecting my work, and I don't really have a choice in the matter, but people that purely buy artwork for the investment value. I just think it's fine if you have a lot of money and you're buying high-end stuff, and you're trading and whatever. I have no problem with that. But if I have any say in who buys my artwork, I would much prefer it be to somebody who actually has a genuine interest in the painting and just likes the image and wants to pass it on to a child or a grandkid, But, that's probably just wishful thinking.
But I get it. It's something I'm.
Art world like super crazy right now with all the $100 million plus.
I know, like that, what's that painting?
The Salvatore.
The Hockney, David Hock.
Oh. That was like a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, or the Banksy thing. It's just like, just like,
It's like insane.
it's just in your face. It's just like the irony of it, like, it's so sad because most artists are just struggling just to pay their mortgage, and then people are kind of making a joke out of it. And it's like, it just shows you that a lot of people are buying artwork not for the love of it, but just for the perceived value that it will achieve. And
It's another instrument.
yeah, I feel like if something is that valuable, it should be in a museum. And that's just me, because then that's something that everyone should get to enjoy, not just locked away in some vault until they decide they want to make money on something. But that's probably why I'm not a rich person, because I don't think that way about money.
Do you ever exhibit in museum shows?
I would like to. I haven't yet, but that is a long-term goal. My, obviously a dream for me would to to get to exhibit in the Autry show or something like along those lines. That's, you know, Western and Indian type of art. Yeah, but you know, every time I go and I see the show, I just go, the quality of work, it would, you know, I just feel like I wouldn't fit in there yet.
I don't think that's true. I think you're psyching yourself out.
Maybe, but at the same time, I don't want to be naive about it, because I'm not going to look at the worst, like 10% of the people. And there's definitely some real clunkers in there, in my opinion. I'm not looking at them. And I'm also not going to compare myself to, you know, the me and C2s and the Morgans, because that's just ridiculous. You kind of have to look at the middle and see what would I bring to the table? What can I bring? I would really like to improve my skills enough so that way I could bring something that it hasn't been brought forth yet. And primarily because I'm painting more feminine subject matter with Native Americans, that's just not really a story that's told. So I need to have my skills to a level of competence that does it justice. I don't want to just be riding on the novelty of something without a skill to back it up. And so that's sort of the situation I'm in, is getting my skill set up to that level. I feel like if it's just a one-off portrait, I might be able to do a decent job, but when I'm trying to compose a scene, you know, I have a pretty good failure rate right now, so I would like to get better at that before. Because the thing is, if say you are fortunate enough, you work hard, you get into something, well, now you got to deliver the goods. And like, that's just terrifying. Like, well, now you're saying I'm quality enough to be in here, but if you do some clunker paintings, you know, and you don't have any like years of basic like some of the people who aren't as good in the show, maybe they got in at an early time and they've had a lot of accolades and they've invested, and they've like put something into it. Like, I'm a new person, and if I show up with a clunker, I don't have anything that's gonna like want to make them keep me. So yeah, it's one of those things. They're not gonna give me a lot of second chances. So, you know, if you blow it, you're done.
One thing I think is really cool about that Autry show is that, like, even though it's Western themed, all the artists in it are still kind of just doing their thing.
That's what I like too.
So it's not like they're forcing their voice into something different for the sake of the theme of the show.
Yeah, I like that too. But I have seen artists put in sort of non-Western subject matter and not sell as well. So you are wise to apply yourself to the clientele that shops. Yeah, just because that's expensive to, you know, just buy your frames and your photography, all that stuff. It's pretty expensive just right up front. So it's not something you want to just kind of, I'll just throw this old study in there. You know, I don't care if it's not even Western. I don't, you know, that'd be kind of ballsy to do that. And, you know, I feel like.
I think the highest priced pieces that sold that I saw from the last year's show, or this year's show, was they weren't like traditional Western pieces. They were more like
Contemporary Western?
They were just landscapes with no human figures.
There weren't even like Logan or any of those people?
No, it was George Carlson.
Oh.
But the paintings were beautiful, but it was like he didn't even have to like contort himself to.
Well,
Still found someone to love.
the thing is, too, is like I've been following that show for 15 years, and things have changed. So in the beginning, when I started going, everything was very traditional, and now this more contemporary spin on that subject matter has become popular. So you, as an artist, you kind of go, well, should I follow trends, or should I just stick to my guns and just wait it out? And that's kind of a question you get, you know, hit with.
Yeah, you have to eat, but you also have to live with yourself at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, do you want to sell yourself? Or maybe you do fall for a really catchy style that sells well, but then a bunch of people buy your work and now they all have one and they don't want it. So then you're like, oh, great, now I got myself typecast. And so, yeah, you know, it's just a weird thing. And if you're painting for trends. But, you know, my gallery will tell me sometimes, hey, can you paint a little, can you do this? Can you simplify the background or do this or that? Because clients are asking for this or that. And that's something I like about a gallery, is that they'll tell me these things because I don't know what they're saying without that.
Yeah, I read this thing. I don't remember where it came from, but it was like, oh, if you make it your business and you get really famous, like doing something novel, like barking like a dog. Like the minute you stop barking like a dog, like to do something else, you'll be like dead to the art world.
It's true. I mean, it is true. All you have to do is go look through those back issue magazines, and you can see, hey, this guy's gone. This guy's gone. What happened to them? Oh, and it's like, or oh, they're still around, or oh, their style's changed since then. You just see the story playing out, even just 10 years ago. It's a dramatic difference.
That's so freaky.
It is freaky, and that's why I always advocate, trying to be true to yourself and paint what you really love painting. Like, I totally didn't mind painting a different subject matter because I still got to find my kind of way of painting it and enjoyment in it, and that's the whole costuming aspect and just working with your hands sort of aspect. But if you had told me I have to change the way I paint something, like I have to paint in a very glazed style or just a completely different style, yeah, I think that would just really not work for me. I don't think I'd be willing to do that. And that was a problem I ran into with colonial work, was that in some of the galleries they were saying our clientele wants it painted in the style of the 1800s.
Oh God.
Yeah, and I'm like, no thanks. I don't. It's just not my. That's been done already, and it was done really well, and I don't even want to. Yeah, and I don't. Yeah, I mean, am I gonna have to grind my own pigments and hire an assistant? It's like, I don't know, like. But I think it's great. There's people who love really traditional techniques, and they marry the painting with the technique, and I think it's great. But I also like the idea of updating the subject matter with a slightly different approach. That's just me. This? Well, this is what I use at home to light my palette. It's an LED, and that's pretty much what I paint with now, is all LEDs. But on my easel, I have like 3 LEDs that are pretty high wattage, and they're different temperatures. But you want to try to kind of match what's lighting your palette to what you have on your canvas, because if something is really cool or warm, then it will make your paint slightly cooler or warmer, and so it's harder to judge what you're doing that way. So the closer you can have them to being the same lighting, the better. But I firmly recommend LEDs because they are more energy efficient, but also because they're much cooler. And in the summer when you're painting under incandescent, I was painting under 300 watt bulbs for a while, and that was like being in a kitchen, you know, like, or under a heat lamp, like roasting. So yeah, it's just, you get more fatigued when you're that hot painting. But yeah, that's another great advantage for artists now, are these LEDs, because they're long lasting and more energy efficient, but they deliver a lot of power. So it's kind of nice.
Oh, really? You can see water. Yeah.
So actually, I want to know which LEDs give you the best neutral or
So they come usually in like what they call, I think, daylight and then warm light. And I think the daylight ones are the cooler and the warm light are obviously the warmer. I have both on my easel. So I have 2 daylights and 1 warm light, because most of the lights in our home are fairly warm. So I try to have the best balance between warm and cool. Whereas if you primarily paint under warm or cool, your image will look different if you remove it from that situation. So I've had, in the past when I was painting under a certain light source, when I sent the painting to the gallery, it looked like a completely different color palette because they had a different lighting system. So now my solution is to work with the most neutral light I can, and that way it won't be so strongly skewed from one direction to the other. So I used to use like those blue north light bulbs or whatever they were called in the old days, and then all my work got sent to the gallery and it was like under yellow lighting, so it just looked really weird. So that's why I've picked more of a neutral kind of LED system.
Do you ever compare notes with the gallery to like make sure that your art is being presented in the best light?
No. I just pretend that they are treating me well and putting my artwork in a good place. But I mean, I have heard horror stories from people where they go to the gallery and they don't have a single piece on the wall. And that probably happens. You know, if they're doing a show, you know, you may not be the one that they are showcasing, so they'll put your work in the back room for that time. But honestly, I've had students go out to my gallery in Tucson and come back and always give me pretty good feedback that I had a pretty good representation of my work on the wall. So that's kind of good feeling. But I was, like my very first gallery I was in up in Carmel, not only did they just throw my artwork in the back room somewhere, but somebody from my husband's side of the family, a friend of the family, called to buy a painting of mine. And the person was like, I don't even know who that artist is.
What?
Yeah. So.
Do they not want to make the sale?
Well, because I was just a little puny newbie with very, very, very small commission for them. They didn't give a darn about that. And so when they called Eric back and said, hey, I went contacted them and they acted like you didn't even show in that gallery. That was it. We went and immediately got in the car and drove up to Carmel and pulled everything out.
Wow. Did you end up selling it directly to the gallery?
Yeah, actually that painting we did, which I don't usually do a lot of, but in their defense, they tried to go through the right channels and they were met with resistance. So yeah, it was just bizarre. But then I looked and I was literally probably the worst person in the gallery. and the lowest priced person in the gallery. I mean, at the time they were showing a guy who was, you know, in the $30,000 range, and I wasn't even getting, you know, $1,000. So the thing is now, galleries don't do that anymore because they know that they need to have a certain percentage of their artists in that lower end because you don't know what kind of client's going to walk in. And rather than thinking everything has to be the next big, great sale, you're going to do better business by starting a collector at a low price and getting them kind of hooked into the idea of collecting paintings. And if something isn't obtainable, or if they feel like, oh, I'd have to be a millionaire to buy anything, they're going to be turned off by that, and you've already lost a lifelong client. But if you can get somebody hooked on to buying original artwork, you might have a client that as their income level progresses, they also purchase more expensive paintings, and that's just smart.
Bob wants to know what scale you prefer to paint for your gallery.
That's a good question. So ideally, like the easiest size for me to work is like 8x10 portraits because they're quick, they're pretty easy, they sell fairly well. Again, they're in that price range that's really affordable for people. And I might sell more of those in quantity than a big piece. But I much prefer painting a larger painting because it's more challenging. The problem with a large painting is if it doesn't sell, and a lot of times mine don't, it just sits around, and then you're reminded of all your failures. So you're like, God, that painting's been there for 5 years and nobody's bought it, so it's just getting worse by the year. And so, you know, there is that aspect of it. So if I had to pick, you know, one size, it would probably be large, but if I had to guarantee it was going to sell more often, I'd be much more excited to do it. But it's kind of weird to have one gallery ask me for larger sizes and the other one's telling me keep things around 18x24 because that's what we're selling right now. It kind of depends on, you know, the market. So, yeah.
You need like a big wall to put a big
You got to think about that. You know, what kind of client is buying your work? Both the places I show in, they're very seasonal towns. So these are usually second homes for people. So they generally have disposable income, but they're also not there year round. So they're not really looking to like just fill their homes to the nooks and crannies. You know, they're looking for collector-based pieces. So yeah, it's tough. I mean, the lazier part of me that likes the guarantee would answer small paintings, you know, under the, you know, 16x20 range. But the other artist in me, the one that wants to get better, would answer the larger paintings.
What's the largest painting you've done?
40x60, which is really hard because I paint in such a small space. So literally with that painting, at times I was sitting it on the floor, sometimes I was sitting up on a stool, sometimes I sat on the ground to work on it. It was really tough, just like moving it around. I mean, it was just like an ordeal. And then transporting it and getting the frame, all of that, it's just really rough. It's not easy. You can't just throw it in a box and ship it off. You've got to like really plan it out. And it's a much bigger investment. Just stretching the canvas took me a day. My hands were shot. It was a pretty good investment of canvas alone and stretcher bars. You know, those things can be like a couple $100 once you're all into it. Then you got to buy the frame. Then you got to paint the painting. But I like the idea of it. Because it makes you feel legitimate. You're like, man, look at this big painting I did. But then again, when it doesn't sell, you're like, it's a big clunker. So you can hide those little flawed paintings. They're just like, whatever, you just, you know, shuffle that one under a desk somewhere. But those big paintings, no, they can't be hidden.
What was the subject matter for the bigger paintings?
I've done a few in that size range. So I've done, one was a girl on a horseback, another was a guy on a horseback, another was several people getting ready for a ceremonial event with horses. And then recently I did a 40x50, and that was like an interior teepee scene. And then most recently I did a 30x40 interior. And I really like the 30x40 range because it's big, So you can get a lot of figures in a scene, but it's more manageable. I don't have to like sit on the ground to paint it or stand up and do weird things to get it painted. So that's my preferred size, is the 30 by 40, because it still has a lot of impact, especially when you get like a 6-inch frame on it.
Do they all sell?
I'd say out of all those, I sold 3 out of 7 of them. So not even quite 50%. But when you do sell them, it's kind of a nice chunk of change. You're like, wow. I mean, that feels like a real check.
It's nice to know that someone loves your stuff that much.
Yeah, you go, geez, I'm flattered. But then you might not get a check for, 6 months. So
Pedro wants to know, do you ever paint in gouache?
I used to work in gouache when I was in a commercial job for Trader Joe's, and I did all their sign painting. So I would do these little gouache signs with all kinds of intricate details. So I used gouache for that because it dried fairly quickly and I could get kind of some quick details in something. But I did it maybe one time here at the school, took some gouache painting because I was new to tiling, and so I kind of did it for that. But they are hard. Like if you spend your time on a gouache, you have to mat it and frame it differently, and they're much more difficult to sell. So that's why I don't really do much of it now. I mean, if a client called and said, can you do some gouache paintings because we've got, I don't know, this person's guaranteeing to buy them, and I might think about it, but probably not, because it's a little more tricky with framing and they have glass. And I know Jeff shipped one off in the glass and the frame shattered and the glass shattered and poked a hole through the painting. So it just kind of always sits in the back of my mind that it's a little, yeah, it's kind of fragile. It's just, if it gets moisture or anything like that, you're going to have issues. Again, when my gallery messed up my painting, they just scratched it. It was pretty easy to fix. But if somebody pokes a hole through your painting, you're done. There's no fixing that. Yeah, it's...
Did you have to fly out to fix it?
No, they just mailed it, and then I learned to package things in a way that's a little more fail-safe. Anticipating that somebody's going to just cut it open quickly with a blade and cut right into it. Yeah, they just box cuttered it. So it was one of those things. And the other time they called me and said there was a scratch on something, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't there when I shipped it out. So I'm pretty sure somebody did that. That was not me, but I could be wrong. This just goes with it. And I've done dumb things too. Like my last show, I shipped all my work and I got up there and I hadn't signed one of the paintings. And I just assumed, oh, no big deal. You guys have some paint here, I can sign it? No. Like, well,
really?
Yeah. And I'm like, well, this is a gallery town. Where's the art store? We don't have one. The closest one is like 60 miles away. I'm like, oh my God, I got to get it signed like in the next hour. So they sent me to this art guild that they had, and no, I know, I couldn't do it. And so, yeah, they sent me all across town, and I found this art guild, and this lady like rummaged through her back cabinet and luckily found something, and it was like a miracle. Like I just couldn't believe it, because I was like, you're gonna have to
knocking on doors.
Yeah, I'm like, you're gonna not be able to, you can't put that painting out because,
Not authenticated.
well, yeah, it has to have a signature. And when I was in a gallery in the early days, I remember sending all my work and they had to send it back for me to sign it. So it's something I've done before, so I should know better. But you get busy, and signing, it's kind of the worst part. Not very fun.
Did you practice developing your painting signature?
Oh no, it's like just the most lame, simple, the easiest signature I can get away with, because I only use my first name, and that's it. And I just make it as
You're like Cher.
simple. Yeah, just like that, only much poorer, without a good wig collection. Yeah, I know people are always like, well, how do you develop a signature? I mean, Jeff has this fancy thing, and he's, and I'm just I try to make it really small and insignificant.
The work is the signature.
That's right. But you need a signature, otherwise, yeah. But I go, you know, if you have a name that's weird like mine, you probably don't need to put your last name on there.
Are you the only Meadow that's a painter?
That I know of, yeah.
That's cool.
I mean, growing up, I only ever met one other person with my name.
Well, Matt Smith, there's like another.
Yeah, Matt Smith. There's already a Matt Smith. I mean, literally, there's already a Matt Smith who's really
He's
good.
also a painter.
Who's a really good painter.
Yeah.
So yeah. I probably should have been, you know, like a landscape painter with my name, but
Alright, I'm Meadow and I paint meadows.
that's right. I only paint meadows, but I hate plein air painting, so that's just not going to work. So you tend to not like the things you suck at. I've noticed. I know, it's like you see either landscape painters and they try to put a figure in their painting and it's pretty bad.
Oh my god, I was just like,
There's these beautiful landscape paintings. I won't name the artist, but we were like looking at how great they were, and the ones with the figures were just like, what the heck?
You're like, don't even bother. That's how I feel. That's how I feel when I paint the figure. I paint the figure and then I got to put the landscape in. And I'm like, oh, the landscape is killing this painting.
it's ruined.
Yeah.
Those are some of like the most beautiful paintings I've ever seen. So I was just like really shocked.
I know. I went to a plein air event, and for some reason the artist decided that that day he was going to paint a person. Whoa. I was like, oh, that was not a very wise decision. I mean, I thought I was impulsive, but that guy was probably going, what am I doing? It's nothing like painting a landscape.
I feel like I can understand though, because it's like you want to like be able to do it all.
You know, you can't. I mean, as a student, you need to be diversified, but then at some point you decide, this is what I'm going to do, and I need to develop this to the fullest potential. And that means you can't do all the other things you want to do as much. You might get to do them a little bit, but really, if you want to be really good at something, you're going to have to spend the majority of your time doing that. And yeah, and it's just the way it is. And it's like, yeah, life's not fair. I mean, yeah, some people are good at everything, like Daniel Keyes, but you know, it's like those people they're just not very common.
He loves his flowers though.
Well, I mean, he's amazing. He's just a really great painter. But I kind of want to go, well, I just want to see how good he paints a face. Let's see that. And then I go, they're pretty good too. It's like, okay.
His, like buildings are good.
Yeah, everything's good.
Well, he's doing sculpture right now. He's like at a sculpture.
Oh boy.
It's like
You know, like Jeremy Mann. He's awesome too. He's like good landscape painter. He's a great figure painter.
he's doing what, like photography and like filmmaking?
Yeah, he's doing like filmmaking. Like, come on. It's crazy.
People are just talented.
Well, I mean, I think some people just don't sleep or something. I just haven't figured it out because I prioritize sleep. So I'm just like, well, if that means I'm not going to be a filmmaker, then that's just the way it is.
I'm always like really confused at like a lot of the old like master painters. Like, how did they do that much work? Just like
I think that's all they did. They didn't have Netflix. You know, if you have Netflix, you're just not going to be you're not going to get as much done.
they didn't have internet.
They didn't have internet.
Smartphone.
They didn't have Instagram. That's just a time sucker.
They found out like how to predict what you like to watch. So it's like you can never look away ever again.
Yeah, I know. They just like feed you with, you know, their poison.
Track that this person stared at this video for this many seconds. I'm gonna show them only these kinds of videos.
Or they looked at this one thing and now we're going to keep showing it in this column until they buy it. They're like, fine, I give up. I'll buy it. I can't resist it anymore.
Like our ad cookies, they're tracking forever.
Yeah, those cookies. Yeah, I don't know. It seems like some people just have more time than others. I don't know. Plus, you think about the old days, they didn't even have electricity. Like when the sun went down, you're done painting.
Done.
Yeah, you're not going to be staying up late at night doing painting. Couldn't afford the tallow.
Talk about like Monet, like scrapping and burning his paintings, and it's like, well, he did that. He still has like 1 million of them left over.
I know. Just go, man. I guess we.
He does like 5 a day.
Well, granted, I mean, some styles are a lot faster than others.
That's true.
I mean, to me, when you hear the word impressionism, you think a quick impression, you know.
Yeah.
You know, and then someone like Sargent who would basically scratch the painting, 10 times until he got what he wanted to make it look like he painted it instantly.
One stroke painting.
Yeah, the one stroke. But we have so many advantages now that, like in terms of technology, just even how we like reach clientele or market ourselves or any of that. In the old days, those people also were kind of, basically they had to paint for either a patron or a church or a religious, audience. So,
The Medici family.
yeah, exactly. And you just didn't really have that. You weren't really considered an artist. You were basically a picture maker.
Workshop on underlings.
Yeah. I mean, and now people are like, I'm an artiste. It's like, oh, come on.
That would be so cool if like that's what Watts became, where it's like a factory sweatshop.
Yes, that would be so cool.
That would be so cool.
Although I wish everyone would paint the part of my paintings I don't want to paint.
Yeah.
Just hire an assistant to come in and paint all the background and
Like I'm the art director.
yeah, make it better. I don't know. It's hard enough to relinquish control. I couldn't imagine tell your assistant to do something, you come back, no, not like that, you idiot.
I always try to make Lois do my work, and
How's that working for you?
I'm like, oh, like that's not what I would have done. He's like,
But you can't make a judgment on that, because if you ask somebody to do something that you should be doing, you've got to accept the result you get. That's like some kind of built-in slave labor you got there.
Lois hates working with me. 'Cause
He hates working with you? Why?
he's like never happy with anything.
Is that the best way to live life?
To what?
Is that the best way to live life?
Never be happy with it.
Yeah. No.
That's just like that's my temperament.
I don't believe that for a second. There's no such thing. You can't be just a completely grumpy, pessimist temperament. No,
Curmudgeon.
can't, because you have to get pleasure in life too. I think painting is just so difficult and so berating on yourself that you got to have some joy in it. Or why would you do it? I mean, there has to be. You have to get some pleasure, like in a sense of accomplishment. Like it's one of the few things that when I get done with a painting and I find areas of it that I'm really happy with, I really feel proud of it. Like I worked really hard. I can tell I worked hard at something. It didn't just fall in my lap. And you can't say that about very many things in life. Most things you can just kind of phone it in, but not artwork. I mean, not good painting. Yeah, you can phone in some of your paintings, but they'll come back to haunt you. Trust me. With the internet now, you never let a bad painting die. Like those other artists in the old days, let's just burn all our bad paintings. But now it's like it's forever captured on Instagram. You're like, no.
Can't let any smart devices near it.
No, yeah, you gotta like hide it or paint it somewhere where you don't have any technology or something.
Yeah, it's like even if you dress it over it, they can use like X-rays.
Yeah, exactly. For me, I mean, I love like Haddon Sunbloom Santas. They're like the best thing ever, and I would never compare myself to him. But if I could paint a subject like that, it would definitely be as close to a Haddon Sunbloom as I could, because they're just really fun and happy. And even though it's just a mythical thing and it's completely ridiculous when you think about it, there is just something just charming about it. It's like, it's just so, who cares? You know, it's not an important thing. And that's what I like about it. And kids love it. They're very excited. And I just remember how I felt. And I believed in Santa till I was probably like 8, which is kind of a long time. And I already knew he didn't exist, but I really wanted to believe in him. But I was already figuring it out, like, God, Santa has the same handwriting as Mom and Dad. Or how come Santa uses the same wrapping paper as my mom and dad? You know, all that kind of, I figured it out. I knew in the back of my mind. But I wanted to believe, because it's just such a great fantasy. I mean, just the idea of it. And I'm just really drawn to painting something that's just this beautiful, happy thing that, you know, it really doesn't, it's, for me, it's not religious, it's not anything, it's just silly. It kind of like makes you feel like a kid, and I like that. Because my other paintings, they're very serious. Like, the subject matter and my intent with the painting is to convey something that's a very serious representation. But with Santa, I just feel like the goofier the better. And I also get to kind of work on expression and add and embellish it in a way that's a little bit more fantasy based. I wouldn't feel comfortable doing that in any other kind of painting. So I feel like I have permission to kind of go a different direction with it. That's why I like it. I know a lot of people like to paint fantasy, and so this is like my version of fantasy. And, you know, I don't like the commercial part of Christmas and all that blah, blah, blah. But I like the idea that people give something to somebody else, and they look out for other people at this time of year and think of children and things like that. So I do like that. I like that aspect of it.
I always felt like the winter holiday season was just designed to get people through the harsh winters emotionally.
Oh, it is, 100%. If you didn't have all those festivities, you would just have,
It would just be misery.
yeah, you would just be like, oh God, I just want to go into hibernation. But yeah, it forces you to get together and to celebrate. And I mean, I love the festivities. I mean, Eric and I don't have children, but we still like to do some of the traditions because they kind of remind us of being a kid. And it's like, if you don't have traditions, you really, I mean, you're just mechanical. And what's the point? You've got to have something that makes you stop what you're doing and do something that makes no sense at all. It gives you an excuse to get together. It's just a really neat thing. And for me, it gets me in kind of the spirit of the season, so I like that.
You haven't done it here.
Plus, who doesn't like to paint a guy with a beard? I mean, that's, oh, no way. That's like you don't have to paint hardly a mouth. Half the face is covered up. He's wearing a big, bulky outfit. That's in red and white, so it's not like a complicated color scheme. But yeah, I think it's like just ideal.
Do you like painting animals?
I don't dislike painting. I do like painting them. I don't think it's like my forte. I like painting horses because they're pretty challenging. And I'd like to paint dogs more, but the last few times I've attempted it, it was because the dog had died, and so it made me really sad, and it was kind of tough to paint.
Shade wants to know what you were doing with the back of your brush.
What do you mean? Oh, this? I was kind of scratching some texture into it because of the beard. Even though most of that will end up getting covered up, sometimes I use other tools besides a brush to create the kind of texture I want. And because this is such a tiny painting, I have to use a really fine tool. Whereas on a larger painting, I might use a palette knife or my finger and get in there, but I can't really control something of that scale on a piece like this.
Is this for him?
Yes. Yeah, I already sent him one Santa painting, so I'm trying to hurry and get this done early next week, so that way I have a chance. If it's gonna sell, it'll be in time, because that's the big thing about this theme is like, well, you have a very short window of sales unless they want to keep it around for a whole year, which they might. But they told me, anything that doesn't sell, we'll buy it, which I've heard that before. I don't know. I mean, that's silly. But
Wait, do galleries do that?
sometimes, yeah, because they can get artwork half off. Why wouldn't you?
Oh.
Most of my galleries have purchased my work because it's 50% off. So why? I mean, smart.
Right. They give themselves the commission.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, you'd be smart if you saw an up-and-comer and you knew their work was going to be valuable. Because galleries are out to make money. They're not just there to just have a store.
Does it just end up in the owner's home?
Yeah, usually.
Do they ever like turn around and sell it again the next
Sometimes.
month?
Yeah, I don't know. I had a gallery that closed down. They had bought some of my work, so I wonder what happened to it. Did they keep it? Did they resell it because they got into financial problems? I don't know. You don't know. Like, where does it end up? In the trash? I mean,
Hope not.
well, Roberto found that James Bama in the trash,
yeah,
so
that's
it can.
crazy. I thought it was a print.
Nope, it can happen to anybody. So if they're gonna throw a Bama away, they'll certainly throw one of my paintings away.
I don't know how that could have possibly happened.
That was a dumb person.
Someone cleaning out like their dead grandpa.
They're like, I hated this painting my grandpa had around. I'm gonna throw
Or
it
maybe
away.
they just thought it was a printout, like a poster.
I doubt it. They
you
probably
don't
just
look
didn't
closely,
like it.
I mean, it's like,
And it's a military subject, so maybe
yeah.
they were like, I hate the war. Just rather than sell it. I don't know.
They just wanted the estate sale to be over.
Yeah, they're like, well, there's one way to end this sale now. Let's just dump it all out. Yeah. I've heard people throw out some amazing stuff in New York, so you only have a limited space, so your square footage is so valuable.
Roberto's new career. He used to be the picker.
He is a bit of a dumpster diver.
Obama picker.
Yeah, man, and heck, I would be too after I found something that good. I'm like, okay, I'm a convert.
Yeah, I saw it on their wall and I was like, what?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. You always hear those stories, but you're like, does that ever happen to anybody?
I totally thought it was just like a made-up Roberto story.
No, because when he first found it, he immediately called Eric and he
Yeah.
texted a picture, and Eric's like, I think it's the real deal.
It's insane.
Yeah, but again, one person's trash, another person's treasure.
And then there's some brand new Obama.
Yeah. But I heard about like that storage locker that they bought at an auction and had like $7.5 million in it.
What, like cash?
Yeah, I'm sure it's drug money, but hey. I mean, most of the time it's just a bunch of junk, but.
Yeah, I've seen storage wars. It's usually garbage.
And plus, I've heard a lot of that's even planted, so it's like,
Oh, like they script it.
yeah.
Well, even if it is scripted, I've seen a lot of episodes that just seem to have only garbage.
Yeah, you're like, oh, it's a bunch
They
of.
just, like, make up a bunch of numbers and they'll be like, oh yeah, we did good.
It's like a broken piano and some back stock, dead stock underwear or something. This will come back in fashion.
People can't even give away their like antique pianos.
I know. It's too bad. There's just no space for them.
But they're so beautiful. That's like my dream if I ever have the space to put an antique piano. I'm gonna go around like Craigslist.
Well, you'll probably find one.
All of them up.
My parents had a really good one, and it just couldn't stay in tune. So I can't remember what they did. They took it apart and like did something with the keys. I don't know. I just remember that used to be the thing I was forced to practice on, and now it's been dismantled. And
It's like it's not my fault that it sounds bad.
I know, seriously. Or hey, I could have been so much better if we had a baby grand.
Working piano.
Yeah.
Yeah, doesn't Daniel Keys also play piano?
Oh God.
Wonderkind.
It's enough to make you want to quit.
Yeah, that guy's unreal.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole range of artists out there. You got to find where you fit in. You got to find what you bring to the table. There's always going to be some superstar, amazing person. Well, that doesn't mean you don't have something important to talk about in your paintings. Even if it is just Santa Claus. I know. I actually like painting it. Huh? I wish he was around to ask him, did you like that career or were you sick of it?
Had to have liked it.
I bet he made a decent living too.
Oh, back then?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're working for Coca-Cola, you better get paid something. I mean, that's a pretty good client. And when you look around, nobody else could do it like that, so.
Where'd you find the Santa impersonator?
So actually, in the past, we had a student here, and her dad, she said, oh, my dad does Santa stuff. I'm like, really? Is he a Santa?
Cool.
Is he like a Santa during the holidays? She goes, well, no, but he'll dress up and he'll do like an event at the library or something like that. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's cool. And then one time he came in and modeled, and I was like, God, he's got a really good cherubic, like the kind of Santa I like. I mean, there's all kinds of Santas for everybody out there, but I don't like the scary one. Yeah, I'm not into the gangster. I'm not into the ones with the really like mean look on. I want the cherub face. I want the elf-like Santa. And so when I saw him, I was like, oh my God, he's just perfect. So I asked him last year, hey, would you mind doing a photo shoot with me? And he was like, oh, okay, And his wife actually dressed up as Mrs. Claus, so it was pretty cool. She looked good. So that'll be another painting I'll probably do next year with the Miss Claus. And so I did a kind of a variety of themes, all different Santa themes. Eventually, we kind of want to put together like a calendar or something like that with all the images. So that's kind of a long-term goal of ours.
Swimsuit Santa.
Huh?
Swimsuit Santa.
Swimsuit Santa. Sure someone's into that. Sexy Santa. My mind is wandering. Trying to keep it PG. Yeah, no sexy. That's probably what I like about Santa. It's not sexy. There's nothing sexy about it, and that's what I like. There's no pressure.
It's pure.
It's pure. It is. It's totally innocent. There's no... I mean, yeah, it's completely commercialized just to sell more toys, but the idea I like a lot.
The first Santa I saw was my mom dressed in a Santa outfit, so I was just really confused.
Did that blow your mind?
I was just like, what? Why? Why are you wearing a beard?
Oh. Are you sure that was for Santa? It could have been something else. She's like,
Pretty sure she borrowed that outfit.
pretty sure.
Like, attacked a real Santa.
Pretty sure that was an event she would do once a month. So, oh, honey, I've got something to tell you.
Where's Brian when you Alicia?
He went home sick.
Yeah, well,
I'm a substitute.
keep it in.
I already voiced my concerns with having Alicia as my moderator. I'm doing better here than I do in my class, so I know. It's true.
Yeah, Meadow's keeping it in.
Nothing bad, nothing bad.
Very chaste.
It is very chaste. PG, man. Because if you give me 13, it's going to go R.
Give her an inch.
Give me an inch. And then there's a dirty joke in there somewhere. No, the people who take my classes, they just know it's not the most serious conversation environment.
That's what they're paying for.
Yeah, they're paying for that really body entertainment. Well, I have a theory that if you're having a good time, you're going to have a much better painting. That's just me. And if you're coming to class for dead silence, then you may as well just stay home, because that's the only place you really get that. Oh, is it 9? Okay. I have met my 3-hour mark. Actually, I got more done than I probably would normally do in 3 hours, but I'd like to do maybe another 3 hours on his face. So that's basically, to me, a gesture. Now I need to go and fine tune it.
Do you have to do that while the paint's still wet?
What I'll probably do when I get home tonight is just soften anything that is clunky, and then I'll be back painting on it Sunday. So it'll probably be sticky, not dry, but tacky. So it'll allow me to kind of work what I need to when it's wet. But again, trying to leave it in a state that's not unfinished. So it's leaving it at this level. Yeah. That's it. Bless you. Yay. Thanks. I made it. I'm hungry too.